Okay, we're recording, and a couple of other people just walked in, so let me very quickly mention what I mentioned before. As we're going through this discussion, I'd like to get some collective ideas. So if you at any point have an idea about, to the answer, what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran, you'll notice a chat area on the top right. Feel free to type your message or your thought in there. And then in the bottom, we have a general discussion. So let's go ahead and get started then. Faith, learning, and the future of Lutheran education. I don't know if we're going to be looking forward a great deal during this talk. It sounded like a catchy title to me. Instead, I'm going to share a little bit of my own journey and some of my own explorations, and hope and pray that maybe some of you will find it useful. Let's start with this. One of my favorite books regarding Lutheran education is an older one from 1960, What's Lutheran in Education? Explorations into Principles and Practices. And Alan Jasmine. And at that point he wrote, to this day, there's no thorough systematic theoretical study of Lutheran education that's been published. If I remember, I think it was around the 60s, mid-60s or something like that, the Board for Parish Education was in the process of trying to write up a document of philosophy of Lutheran education. And I have about a 250-page document that is part of that work. To the best of my knowledge, it was never completed. There might be a number of possible answers to why. One is maybe there were some political things going on in Synod that might have interfered at the time. Some of us are probably familiar with that. It might also be that there isn't a single philosophy of Lutheran education, at least not one that there's enough consensus to pursue in some kind of master work. There are a number of pieces out there that certainly represent philosophical perspectives on Lutheran education, however. And I'm going to start by just talking about some that have had an influence in my life. And if you look under related resources in the bottom left, you'll see some of them. If we could go back to the 1500s, certainly Martin Luther wrote his sermon on keeping children in school, and I have a link there also to the establishing and maintaining of schools, his essay there. The Large Catechism has quite a bit to say about education also. Even Luther's commitment to the fact that learning should be fun shows up in the Large Catechism. And that first link, It's a Different World, or is it, that's not really related to a philosophy of Lutheran education. But the last one, An Introduction to the Foundations of Lutheran Education. It is, that's the Rachel book that was published, I guess it's almost 10 years ago now. It seems like it was just yesterday. One person just mentioned that they're not seeing any resources on the bottom left. Is that true for others? Let me just see a quick chat response. Not seeing it. I move it up here. Let me know. What do you see? Looks like an empty box to you. Okay, very good. We'll fix that soon enough. I'll just move some things over into the chat area. Very good. I'll just take you on a quick tour. If I click on the first one, now this may pop up a browser window on your computer. And if you have multiple boxes open, you might have to look down at the bottom of your computer screen to see a window that popped up. This just took you to a document. It was published or presented to the Wisconsin Educational, or the WELS, Association of Lutheran Educators Conference. And that was the first link. Second one, A Sermon on Keeping Children in School. Many of you have access to that in one way or another, but I'll give you a link to a website right here for it. The other reference to Martin Luther, I'll put here in the chat area for you. The Large Catechism, my guess is most of you have that one, but I'll also put it in here. And the Introduction to Foundations of Lutheran Education, I just have a link to the CPH site. where you can learn more about the book if you haven't checked it out um, up to now. So thanks for pointing that out about the resources. Okay, so this philosophy of Lutheran education has been something that's been a question for me too. I taught theology in Lutheran high school and middle school for 12 years, and in two different schools. And in both schools, I had lots of conversations with individuals, and I never really discovered a consensus on what constitutes a Lutheran education. In my own formation, though, there are a few books that have had an impact. One is this Rachel book, An Introduction to Foundations of Lutheran Education. And the other one actually goes all the way back to 1956, where Lutheran Education Association used to publish annual yearbooks. And this 13th yearbook was full of wonderfully engaging and interesting and provocative essays on readings in Lutheran philosophy of education. That one is hard to find, and I have a copy of it in the library here at Concordia University, Wisconsin. But I'm working with individuals at LEA, and hopefully we'll be putting some of those yearbooks online soon to make them available. Other books that have been formative for me. This is one, well, let me just kind of contrast. These first two books are about a philosophy of Lutheran education, sort of philosophical perspectives. The second book is a different angle. How many of you have heard of this? Just in the chat pod, click a yes if you've heard of this book before and a no if you haven't. This would have been perfect for a poll. I just was too lazy to create one at the moment. So I see a lot of no's. Maybe we'll see some other yeses pop up, but I had never heard of it. Kurt Krieger has heard of it. I had never heard of it because I'd never been to Australia, and I didn't know who Malcolm Barch was, who wrote his doctoral dissertation. I believe he might have written it. I don't know if he studied here at one of the two seminaries for his doctorate. I'm not sure, but his doctoral dissertation was turned into this book. And what I loved in my visit to Australia recently and learning about Australian Lutheran education is that they reference something called educational theology. I don't think we use that term or that phrase in the States very much, but it truly is a theology of education. It's not just philosophical underpinnings for education, but they're exploring theological underpinnings for education. And this book actually seems to be a blending of both the philosophical and the theological. And that's had a pretty significant impact upon my thinking of Lutheran education also. Let me share a couple of other resources. Go and Make Disciples by Jane Fryer for a number of years has been a staple in teacher education programs and Concordias around the country. And I continue to use it in the course I teach for undergraduates, Teaching the Faith. And it's a book that talks about teaching the faith in the context of a Christian day school and deals with very relational issues. So it approaches this question of what's Lutheran education in terms of relationships and a very nurturing, pastoral kind of spirit. The book on the left side was published just in the last year or two by a colleague, Russ Molds, at Concordia University, Nebraska, a teacher of the church, or edited by him, and it's a series of essays. The reason I include these two together on a slide is because while the first couple of books dealt with philosophy and the second one sort of this educational theology, now these two start to bring in the people involved in Lutheran education. They begin to explore this answer to the question, what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran, by looking at those who are involved and what they do and what they don't do, and the things that they say and believe and the like. And this last perspective is one that's caught my attention quite a bit recently. And if you were to ask me, 3 years ago, when I first came to Concordia University, Wisconsin, what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran? I would have gone up here in the top right-hand corner, and I would have answered the teachers. The more I thought about it, the more I came to believe, as much as I do certainly believe that the content and the substance of what we teach and the curriculum and the Christian worldview issues and all of those things are important. If I get at the heart of it, it seems to me that those things have to be embodied and represented and taught and shared and proclaimed through the lives and words of the teachers. And as a result, when I had my call to Concordia University, Wisconsin, and I came here, I found myself asking some tough questions. Um, and that's what I'm going to talk about most of the time. Before I do, let me give you one other book. This is not a Lutheran source, but it's John Westerhoff, and he wrote a book called Will Our Children Have Faith? The reason I add this to the discussion is because this is probably the most recent addition to my journey to answer the question, what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran? And it forces me to actually get rid of the question, what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran? And it challenges me to ask the question, what makes Lutheran education Lutheran? Westerhoff challenges us to think about the possibility that perhaps schooling is not the solution to spiritual formation in the church, and that maybe the school is one piece of the puzzle. But we have parish education, the informal experiences of kids, family life, the communities in which they live, and all of those things that contribute to the spiritual formation. So let me go back to that what makes a Lutheran school Lutheran question, and my coming to Concordia University, Wisconsin, and coming into a very diverse faculty when it comes to belief systems and ideas and experiences in some ways. And so I started to ask myself, how can I figure out what's going on here at Concordia University, Wisconsin, about the different perspectives? And I began to think about my previous experiences in Lutheran schools, remembering that there were a wide variety of people. When I had those private, intimate, one-on-one conversations with people about Lutheran education, about faith and learning, I got a wide variety of answers. And so what I decided to do is um, I set up informal interviews and started having conversations with people, and not a formal research study or anything like that. And I began to sort of jot down in my mind sort of the key themes. And after having had conversations and recorded my memories of conversations with 50, 60 plus individuals, I decided to kind of break them up into sort of these emergent themes, these categories that characterize, that represent the different viewpoints that I saw. And as I did that, I came up with sort of 8 distinct categories. And I use the word distinct loosely because in some ways they're not distinct. There's a lot of crossover. And as you look at these different perspectives and I share them, you'll find that none of us fit into one specific category all the time. Maybe we'll find ourselves jumping around between these different categories. Here's the first one that I found. Terms, and this was certainly in the minority, but it was on occasion that I'd run into someone in a Lutheran school setting, and their view was summed up in terms of the word uncertainty. The instructor had a Christian faith, but they were afraid to talk about it with students, or they weren't sure about the implications of the faith for what they were teaching, for teaching science or math or the social sciences or whatever it might be. Um, Most of the time in those conversations, they were willing to learn and grow if resources were provided. A couple of cases not, but most of the time they were. Um, but there was a great discomfort, and many times it had to do with the idea that they weren't Lutheran and they were teaching in a Lutheran school and they were uncertain for that reason. Others had grown up in the church but never really thought about how their faith would inform what they did. Um, the learner, their view of the learner was that the learner focuses upon the course content, apart from Christian implications. Learn your math and use it. Learn science, basic scientific facts and principles, and you'll use it in a job or future vocation or something like that. Um, the second category that sort of emerged was one that I've labeled private faith. This is the instructor or the teacher who strives not to contradict or undermine the Christian school mission, but silently, privately, they have some differences. In some cases, very strong, sometimes rooted in some powerful lived personal experiences, some struggles, other times just a contradictory belief system, a belief system that clashed with the school that they were teaching in. Please do note that this ultimately doesn't just represent my experiences at Concordia University of Wisconsin, but other schools also. And also the learner, the learner view is a focus upon the content apart from Christian implications. So this private faith, this maybe you've even run into before, where you've had a conversation with people about faith matters, and they said, well, I really think that Christianity or my faith is a private thing. It's not something to be talked about or shared in public, something they sort of um, keep to themselves. The third perspective, and this one I ran into fairly often, was personal witness. This person believed that being in a Christian school meant that they serve as a positive witness to the faith by what they do and by what they say. In fact, it was very common in this group to hear that St. Francis quote, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words, or similar ideas like actions speak louder than words. Not that they didn't think about speaking the message in words also, but this particular group, whenever I looked at the themes that emerged, it was often that idea that we model the faith by our examples. Um, and, and when it came to really teaching a Christian perspective on the content, in this group, that wasn't as much of a consideration. On occasion, it would show up a little bit, but not as much. So their focus was on being a good Christian role model. And the learner is to be an observer of this witness and one who perhaps imitates it and is influenced by it. Let me just stop for a moment. I have 5 more of these, so I want to give people a chance to post any comments or questions they might have. I noticed Cheryl's typing, so I'm going to wait a moment. Oh, okay, great. Well, feel free to jump in with questions and comments. I'll try to pay attention to some of the statements that are showing up and respond as those statements as I see them. Here's the 4th category: faithful service. This one was actually not in my characterizations in the first round, and someone challenged me. They said, "I don't see myself anywhere in there. I don't really see a Lutheran worldview represented in there as much." And I started to think back and revisit some of the quotes and questions, and I put this category in also: faithful service. This is where the teacher sees their role as a Christian vocation, and we certainly see, the literature and a lot of talk recently about the doctrine of vocation in the Lutheran Church, maybe in part due to some of Dr. Reith's contributions on the matter, and the Wingren text and some others about vocation. But this idea of vocation and God calling us to something, and that a milkmaid doesn't have to be saying Jesus loves me while she's milking the cow in order for it to give glory to God. That God is working through those various vocations, that you don't have to somehow force or Christianize um, being a mechanic or a scientist or whatever in order for it to be service to God. And a lot of talk about the 2 kingdoms here. So the scholarship need not have a theological component in order to glorify God. Instead, the focus is upon being faithful within one's calling, whether it be a historian, a physical therapist, theologian, a milkmaid, a kindergarten teacher, a writer, or whatever it might be. And the learner also has a vocation of student, called to excellence and responsibility of thought and conduct consistent with that vocation. So this one did show up, but in all honesty, this didn't show up that often. Only a handful of people that seem to resonate with this category the most. The next one is Christian environment. Now this person seemed to focus. It's less about the person and more about kind of the role that they see themselves having. They saw their role in a class or in a school or a learning environment as having the challenge of creating an environment, an experience, an overall ethos or feel that promotes Christian values and character. And they're a Christian community builder. And this is a person who maybe they use the word facilitator um, or guide, or um, sometimes there's a pastoral sort of feeling to these conversations. And the learner participates in and learns from being part of this Christian community. And maybe the teacher sees themselves as a key leader, other times maybe one participant with just some extra responsibilities along the way. Um, yeah, Cheryl wrote, showed, I wonder if these categories are also divided by age group. That's generation of the teacher. You know, I did ask that question, and this wasn't a formal study of any sort, but I did not see a significant pattern related to age here. I ran into a wide variety of people, for example, here. Now, this is in part because I created these categories myself, looking at the statements, and it might have a little bit of my own creative mind involved in it. Some from previous generations might not have used the word facilitator as much, but some did seem to focus more on the Christian environment. And even when we brought up conversations about their church life in the past, some would talk about how church has changed, it has become less personal, how we've lost that sense of community whenever the church was sort of the center of the local town and people gathering and the like. And the same thing for the school, and how the school was very closely connected to the church life. Those kinds of comments might have ended up into this category. The next one is Christian worldview presentation. And this is a person who informs the learners of the Christian belief system, the Christian perspectives on the content. And then they give students choice on what to do with this information. This is the person who informs them, though, not argues for the Christian worldview, simply would say, for example, if they were teaching creation evolution, here's the intelligent design perspective on this topic. And here is the theistic evolution, the creationist, the non-theistic evolutionist, and maybe they'd simply place the categories before the students and put the arguments there, and perhaps consider it their role to not take a stand, but to put it out there in an unbiased format and leave it up to the students to make a decision on what they think is correct. The learner's job is to discover Christian perspectives related to the content, and maybe make some decisions about whether they're valid or useful. This perspective came up mostly in my conversations with people in higher education. I didn't run into this as much in the K-12 environment, but I'm sure there are plenty of people who could be represented by this. The next one is Christian worldview apology. Apology in terms of defense, not in terms of saying you're sorry. And this is the person who kind of takes that step 6, the one that we just talked about. Now they inform the learner of the Christian worldview, but they also want to defend it as truth. So this person may describe theistic evolution and 6-day creationism and the traditional sort of atheistic evolution, or whatever other categories they might. But in the end, they're going to defend what they believe to be the truth, the biblical understanding of this topic, that they don't want to leave it neutral ultimately. Instead, they want to represent it. Um, they want to represent the biblical truth and argue for it, make a defense for it. And the Bible passage that would often pop up for those who believed in this would be the First Peter 3:15. But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect. And the role of the learner is to discover Christian perspectives and grapple with, take a position on the implications of the Christian worldview for the content area. The role is seeker of truth. By the way, I should note that these categories, I'm not trying to sell one over the other necessarily, and they're not meant to be necessarily steps, like number 7's better than 6, 6 better than 5, and so forth. These just are the categories. But I did put them in order in terms of, to some degree, in terms of sort of levels of complexity. The last one I called Christian, for a lack of better terms, Christian discipleship. And this is sort of the person that just didn't seem to fit dominantly in any one of the categories, but they wanted to engage the learner in mind, body, spirit. You actually see the mission of Concordia University, Wisconsin in here, so maybe you do see my own bias. Maybe this is the one I value the most. But this encompasses a Christian worldview thinking, but other forms of spiritual formation also. So this person seemed to represent 3 or more of the other categories. Maybe Christian worldview teaching, relationship building, role modeling, that they brought up a lot of these, and they seem to emphasize many of them. And the learner, their role is to develop in mind, body, and spirit in service to Christ and the church and the world, which is, by the way, the Concordia University, Wisconsin mission statement. So those are the 8 categories that I came up with in my discovery. And just to share with you sort of what I did with these, the reason I ended up doing this is I thought it would help me get a handle on the topic and on the question of faith and learning, and to better understand where I'm serving now at Concordia University, Wisconsin. But how I used these categories is I brought them back to the School of Education, and I'm a part of the School of Education here at Concordia University, Wisconsin, and we use this as a way to have a conversation, to say, where do you see yourselves? Do you argue for one over the other? Is it a matter of timing? Does it have to do with where the students are in their faith walk? And we ask a number of questions. In fact, I put a few of them here. One is, what are the differences in faith, knowledge, behavior, attitude requirements for an educator to teach from one or more of these classifications? And what type of preparation, personal development, or spiritual formation is necessary? You know, in the university level, the idea is that a person would eventually have a terminal degree, a doctorate, or a Master of Fine Arts, or whatever the highest degree is in their field when they're teaching, or they either have one or they're working toward it. And it's rare, though, in many instances, and especially in many disciplines, some disciplines just don't have many options to get a terminal degree from a university that would help you explore faith implications. That's often left up to the individual. And so, one of the things that we find, for example, my PhD or my doctorate is in instructional technology, and I actually did tweak that. My research was on the social, spiritual, ethical implications of technology in society, and so my dissertation certainly dealt with some faith issues. But in my community, there were few other people asking faith questions, and so I found myself having to work sometimes twice as hard with my Bible open in one hand and good Christian literature in one hand, and other resources from my discipline in the other, and to begin to work through that. But many in higher education don't necessarily have, they didn't necessarily have a really clear tool to help them ask those questions as they were working through their field. And in some cases, some might have actually been taught to compartmentalize the faith in one way or another. And so, and I'm talking about higher education, that's where I am right now. But I find that too in our Christian school system, in our Lutheran school system. We have a growing number of teachers who didn't go through the Lutheran university system, and they come from a variety of state schools and other schools where maybe they hadn't been challenged to think about the implications of the Christian faith um, on different disciplines and content areas, and think about how the faith would shape the nature of a Christian school. And so, a lot of discussion that could go into this first question. The second one: what, if any, benefit can come from using a classification like this to clarify our understanding and position on faith and learning in higher ed? I mean, that was the question I posed, um, and uh, and the answers that I got from that varied. I mean, some people didn't see a lot of value. They thought this was just an overcharacterization. What I found to be valuable, though, is I put these out there on paper, and it was okay for us to talk about them because it was a little less personal at first. We could just sort of look at the categories and say, what are the benefits, the drawbacks of this perspective, of this silent dissident, or the worldview apologist, or whatever it might be. And so I found it to be a tool to open up discussion. I think we might have had a healthier and more in-depth conversation because we were able to put these characterizations out there. And then we could go back to the question next and ask about, where do you see yourself? The other questions: what are the potential dangers of using a classification like the one above? Does it potentially blind us to a more helpful, more biblical model for thinking about faith and learning in Lutheran higher ed, or in Lutheran education in general? I don't know the answer to that for sure. I'm certainly open to it, and I'm open to that, and I look forward to any feedback that some of you might have. The next question: what are similar and distinct implications of this classification for different disciplines? I write higher ed again because these were the questions that I asked as we explored this as a school of education at Concordia University, Wisconsin. But what are the similar and distinct implications of this classification for teaching history, for teaching reading, English, math, whatever it might be? And then, what are the implications for the commissioned and or ordained minister in Lutheran education? Again, I'm just posing these questions from a higher ed perspective, but are these implications any different than they may be for others? So those were some of the questions that we used. And again, I'm sharing this sort of autobiographically. This was my effort to better understand faith and learning at a school, and my effort to create a tool to help us discuss faith and learning. Let me stop there for a moment and see if you have any comments or questions or reactions to this. And I maybe have some questions to get a little group participation to follow up also. I see a couple of comments are coming. We'll just wait for them. Dale, I'm glad you found the perspectives helpful. They did the same thing for me as I began to see them unfold, and I really did. I mentioned that there's creative work in there, but I really did try to let them speak for themselves, let the categories speak for themselves. Oh, Dr. Krieger, you said you've used the categories in faculty orientations. Oh, good. Yeah, I'd be interested in hearing how that worked for you, or how it worked for them. Cindy, in what ways can we use this at the elementary level in faculty meetings and in service? Well, I guess that's a question I'll leave to leave for you to answer, but I can brainstorm certainly with you a little bit. And I do think that the model that I used of just posing those existing 8 categories to the group, saying, where do you see yourself? What do you think is most important for our school, for our students? Maybe craft some questions surrounding those 8 perspectives and use them as just a discussion prompt. However, what may be helpful is not using the 8 categories that I created or that I identified, but maybe it would be most helpful to go through and to maybe have conversations with individuals and see if you can create your own categories. Perhaps creating your own, and then you could bring these in and say, here's what another person tried, and compare and contrast. That might be an interesting dynamic to the conversation also. No, that's perfectly fine. By the way, regarding that, we are right near the end of the time, so I'm going to actually stop the recording, but I'll be here to continue the discussion for those that want to. So I'll stop the recording for the sake of those who want to listen later. Maybe they don't want to hear all of our conversation.